Hi, it's Claire and welcome to Needle Say More. So you know me, I'm always looking for ways to use up my scraps. So on the Tilly & Buttons website, I found a pattern for a tailor sausage and I thought it'd be a great way to use up my remnant pieces and my scraps. So I'm going to do the lining with, this was the edge of a bed sheet that I had to cut down to fit a bed. I'm going to use this is another offcut for the top of the ham, and then this bright pink as a contrast with the check for the base, and then I'm going to stuff it with all my scrap offcuts, and I'm hoping it's a way to use up remnants, way to use up scraps. It's going to be a really good project, so let's get started. So I have got, this is going to be my lining, and because it was a duvet cover, I've got the outer and the inner. So the pattern says cut 2 of the shell on the fold. So if I fold this in half, that will give me 2 pieces. So I'm going to cut it on the fold, and then any leftover bits I'm going to stuff inside. If you do have a rotary cutter and pattern weights, it's good to start off with little projects like this, building up your confidence. You can use scissors and pins alternatively if you want to. So we're going to cut around 2 layers for the lining, and then either 2 layers for the outer, or if like me you want a contrast, I cut out 1 layer for the outer in the bright pink, and then this kind of herringbone grey blue. This pattern is really useful because it's got little darts on it for the shape, but to make it really easy to mark out darts on my tailor's ham, I'm just going to cut along the darts like that and that. So I need to mark these out on both lining pieces and both outer and inner. So if I lie it over, and then I can just use my friction pen to mark on the dart like that, and then just to draw inside this one. Like that. I've used the cutout to mark out all the darts on the tailor sausage. Although on the tailor's ham I did the darts separately, I decided on this piece to do the lining and the outer in one. So I did the darts as a double layer. So I did the darts on the lining and the outer at the same time. And this did save a substantial amount of time. So there's 4 darts on the top and 4 darts on the bottom, so 8 in total. So this meant that I only had to do 8 darts rather than 16, and this gives the tailor sausage that lovely 3D shape. The next step when you've constructed all of the darts is to construct the main part of the tailor sausage. If you do like to add handmade labels, I would recommend adding it at this point when you join the top to the bottom pieces. I did pin this all the way around. You may have noticed in the dart step, I folded and stitched them, but at this point I have securely pinned it all the way around, and this is because when it's constructed I want the darts on the top and bottom to be completely in line. If you do make your own clothes, you know how much it would annoy you looking at your tailor's sausage and the darts aren't aligned on the 4 corners. So I did take a little bit of time here to pin it and make sure I went all the way around, pinning the lining and the outer so all 4 layers are pinned together, which is slightly different to how I did it with the tailor's ham in a previous video. Once it's all pinned together, remember you do need to leave a gap where you're going to insert the scraps so you can fill it and you can turn it the other way around. Once it's pinned together, you're going to sew around the edge 1 centimetre from the raw edge with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, remembering to leave a gap to turn it through. At the start and end of stitching, I would recommend back stitch, reverse stitch, so that it's really, really strong on the edge of the seam when you come to stuff it, and when you turn it through later, it'll make the next stage of stuffing and hand stitching much easier. The next stage is to turn it through to the right side. So take a little bit of time to push through all those darts, make sure all the corners are totally pushed through, and that it's a really nice 3D shape. If there's any loose threads at this point, you can trim those off, and any little neatening off bits you want to do before we stuff it. Now for my favourite part, to put all your scraps and offcuts in there. So you want to pack it really, really tightly. So try and get as much as you can in, because there will be a little bit of air and space in between all your scraps, and you don't want it to flatten down later on. So try and stuff it as much as you can. And this is great for using up little bits of thread, little tiny offcuts kind of from your overlocker, or little offcuts from projects. And you'll be able to pack loads in, even though it's quite a small space. You need to make sure that the opening isn't too wide, so that we can still stitch it together in the next stage. Once you think you're at the point you're ready to sew, just check that you're happy with it. It's nice and thick and full all the way up and down. So to sew it together, we're going to use hand sewing needle and thread, and we're going to use a ladder stitch. You want to start a little way in on the seam where you back stitch, so that it's a really strong join, and you're going to do running stitch on either side of the gap. So you're going to do one running stitch on the top, one running stitch on the bottom, one running stitch at the top, one running stitch at the bottom, and this will create almost a ladder in between the stitches. And you're going to go along the opening doing this, and then when you get to the end, you can pull the stitches together and it completely closes the gap, and you won't see any of your stitch lines. I normally go over and do this over the seam 2 or 3 times, just to make sure it's a really strong join, so that you're not pressing at a later stage and the seam pops open. If you wanted to do a different hand sewing technique, a nice neat hand stitching technique equally, that would work just as well. Here she is, all finished. So she's completely sustainable, made from offcuts and scrap fabric. Really, really useful for pressing and making sure you get a really neat finish.